My, my name is Grace Ellison. I'm 39, married to my husband Owen for 14 years, and for the last 12 of them, I believed my mother had simply stopped trying to reach me. No dramatic fight. No final phone call. Just a slow, painful fade after my wedding, the kind of quiet distance you eventually stop questioning because questioning it hurts more than accepting it. The call had come 2 days earlier. My mother, Eleanor Voss, had suffered a serious stroke. The hospice nurse said she was stable for now, but that if there was anyone I needed to see her, I shouldn't wait. I drove 4 hours with my hands shaking on the wheel, rehearsing an apology for a decade of silence I'd always assumed was mutual. "She has your letters," the nurse repeated, when I didn't respond. "The ones you've been sending. She keeps them in the drawer by her bed. Some of them she's asked me to read 3, 4 times." "I haven't sent any letters," I said slowly. "Not in years." The nurse's expression shifted, confusion sliding into something more careful. "That's strange," she said. "Because your mother has one arriving almost every month, regular as clockwork. She always knows exactly who they're from before I even open the envelope." I stood frozen in that hallway, the guilt I'd carried for 12 years suddenly curdling into something else entirely, a cold, sick suspicion that the story I'd believed about my own mother might never have been true at all. I found my mother sleeping when I finally reached her room, smaller than I remembered, tubes and monitors surrounding a woman who used to run an entire accounting firm with nothing but a sharp pencil and sharper attention to detail. I sat beside her bed for almost an hour before she woke, and when she did, her eyes found mine with a clarity that startled me. "Gracie," she whispered, "you came." "Of course I came, Mom." My voice broke on the word Mom, and used in a way that felt foreign in my own mouth. "I told the nurses you would," she said. "I told them, once she gets my letter about the surgery, she'll come." "What letter, Mom? I didn't get a letter." Her brow furrowed, confusion crossing a face that had spent the last hour looking so peacefully certain. "I sent it 3 weeks ago. Same as always. First of the month." She reached for my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. "You always write back eventually, even if it takes you a while these days. I understand you're busy." I sat with that sentence for a long, disorienting moment. Right back. My mother believed, apparently, that some version of correspondence had continued between us for years, a correspondence I had no memory of receiving or sending. That night, I drove home and went straight to the small filing cabinet where I kept old paperwork, searching for any letter from my mother I might have simply forgotten. I found exactly 3, all from the first year after my wedding. Nothing after that. Not one single envelope in 11 years, despite my mother's absolute, unwavering certainty that she'd written one every single month without fail. Something didn't add up, and the shape of it was starting to feel less like grief and more like a mystery I needed to solve. I told Owen everything the next morning, watching his face carefully as I explained what the nurse had said, what my mother believed, the gap between her certainty and my own empty filing cabinet. "That's strange," he said slowly, "because I always understood it was more mutual than that. I thought your mom made it pretty clear after the wedding that she wasn't comfortable staying close." "What are you talking about? My mother never said anything like that to me." Owen frowned, something uncertain crossing his face. "My mom mentioned it, years ago. Something about your mother saying some pretty harsh things about our relationship, needing space from the family. I just assumed you two had worked out your own version of distance and I wasn't supposed to push." I felt something cold slide down my spine. "Your mom told you my mother said that?" "I think so. It was a long time ago, Grace. Why does it matter now?" It mattered because I was now looking at 2 completely different stories, told to 2 different people, both of us quietly accepting a version of estrangement neither of us had actually witnessed firsthand. My mother believed I'd simply stopped writing back. Owen believed my mother had rejected our marriage outright. Both stories conveniently ensured that neither of us ever felt the need to reach out and check. "Owen," I said carefully, "who actually told you that?" "Word for word, as best you remember." He was quiet for a long moment, working backward through a memory he'd apparently never once questioned in 12 years. "My mom," he finally said. "She was the one who told me." I went back to see my mother 3 days later, notebook in hand this time, determined to understand exactly what she remembered instead of simply absorbing her grief alongside my own confusion. "Tell me about the letters," I said gently. "From the beginning. Everything you can remember." She talked for almost an hour, her memory sharper on this particular subject than on almost anything else. The specific stationery she used, the post office 3 blocks from her old house, the small ritual of walking there on the first of every month for over a decade. She remembered writing about my wedding anniversary each year. She remembered asking about a promotion I'd mentioned once, early on, and never hearing back about how it went. "I stopped expecting long replies," she said. "You always seemed so busy. But I kept writing anyway. I thought, even if she doesn't have time to write back properly, she should know her mother is still here, still thinking about her." I asked when the promotion I'd mentioned would have been. She named a year. I did the math slowly in my head, and the timeline landed with a jolt I felt in my chest. That was almost exactly when Owen and I moved into our house. The house Judith had personally helped us find, helped us move into, and had, from that very first week, insisted on handling the mail. "We're always so busy," she'd said cheerfully, holding up a spare key we hadn't actually offered her. "Let me sort through this for you, dear. No sense wasting your evenings on junk mail and catalogs." I sat in my car outside the hospice that afternoon, staring at nothing, feeling 12 years of assumed grief reorganize itself into something with a very specific shape. I brought it up carefully at first, not an accusation, just a question, testing the water before I said anything I couldn't take back. "Judith, did my mother ever send anything to the house?" "Back when we first moved in." Judith didn't even look up from the casserole she was assembling in my kitchen, a weekly ritual I'd once found comforting and now watched with entirely new eyes. "I don't recall anything specific, sweetheart." "Why?" "She says she wrote every month. 4 years. Well." Judith finally glanced at me, her expression arranging itself into something sympathetic and faintly concerned. "The Postal Service loses things all the time, Grace. Especially back then, before everything went digital." I wouldn't read too much into it. "I know this is a hard time, with your mother's health, but chasing down old mail mysteries isn't going to help either of you right now. It just seems strange that it would happen every single month, 4 years, and nothing else ever went missing. I really don't know what you want me to say." Her voice cooled slightly, the warmth retreating just enough for me to notice. "I think you're under a lot of stress right now, and maybe looking for something to make sense of feelings that don't have an easy explanation." "That's understandable. But digging up old painful things isn't going to change anything for your mother now." I stood in my own kitchen, watching a woman I'd trusted for over a decade calmly, gently suggest that my grief was making me irrational, the exact same quiet redirection, I realized with a slow, sinking clarity that might explain 12 years of silence in the first place. I couldn't let it go, not after that conversation, not after watching Judith's carefully measured deflection land exactly where it was meant to, designed to make me feel unstable for asking, rather than curious about an actual pattern. I went back to my mother's old neighborhood the following week, tracking down Marlene, the neighbor who'd lived across the street from her for over 20 years and still sent a Christmas card every year. "Oh, she wrote to you religiously," Marlene said, without hesitation, settling into a porch chair like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask. Every first of the month, rain or shine, I used to see her walking to the mailbox on the corner with that same blue envelope. She'd wave and say, "Off to see if I can get a word out of my daughter this year." She said it like a joke, but I could tell it wore on her. Did she ever say anything about the letters not being answered? She used to wonder aloud sometimes. Never bitter about it, just puzzled. She always assumed you were simply too busy for a full reply. I don't think it ever crossed her mind that something might actually be wrong. I sat with Marlene for another hour, piecing together a timeline that matched my mother's memory exactly. A decade of consistent, deliberate effort, arriving at my house every single month and vanishing completely before it ever reached me. Whatever had happened to those letters, it wasn't the postal service losing things at random. It was something far more deliberate, and I had a sinking, certain feeling about exactly whose hands they'd passed through first. I waited until Judith and Owen's father's old business partner invited us both over for a family barbecue, the kind of afternoon where Judith would inevitably disappear into her garage to grab folding chairs, leaving her house momentarily, carelessly unattended. I told myself I wasn't planning anything. I told myself that right up until I found myself standing in Judith's garage, ostensibly looking for extra chairs, scanning the neatly labeled storage boxes stacked along the back wall. Tax documents, holiday decorations, Owen, childhood. And then, tucked on a lower shelf, slightly apart from the others, a plain cardboard box with a single word written on masking tape in Judith's precise handwriting. Correspondence. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside, organized by year with the same meticulous care my own mother applied to her financial ledgers, were envelopes, dozens of them, all in the same handwriting I recognized instantly, all addressed to me at my own home address, every single one still sealed, unopened, undelivered. I sat down hard on the concrete floor of that garage, pulling out envelope after envelope, watching 12 years of my mother's quiet, faithful devotion stacked in careful, deliberate rows in a box labeled with a word so clinical it made my stomach turn. Correspondence. Not stolen. Not hidden by accident. Filed. I heard Judith's footsteps approaching from the yard, cheerful and unhurried, entirely unaware that I was sitting on her garage floor surrounded by 12 years of evidence that the woman who'd baked me casseroles every week, who'd stood beside me at my own wedding, had spent over a decade deliberately, systematically stealing my mother from me. She stopped in the doorway, and I watched her face move through a rapid, practiced sequence, surprise first, then something calculating, then finally, once she understood there was no explanation that would work anymore, something colder underneath all of it. Grace. 12 years, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You kept every single one. You don't understand what your mother was like, Judith said, abandoning the pretense entirely, something raw and defensive breaking through. At your wedding, she cornered me. Told me I was too controlling, that I needed to let you and Owen build your own life without me hovering over every decision. She had no right to say that to me. So you erased her. From my entire life. For 12 years. I protected this family, Judith said, chin lifting. Your mother was going to poison you against us. Against me. I watched what she was trying to do, and I made sure it never got the chance to work. Owen appeared in the doorway behind her, having heard enough of the conversation to go pale. Mom, you told me Eleanor didn't want contact. You told me she said something horrible about our marriage. I told you what needed to be told, Judith said, and for the first time, her composure fully cracked, something desperate creeping into her voice. I was protecting both of you. You lied to both of us, I said. Separately. For over a decade. So neither of us would ever think to ask the other person directly. Judith's silence finally, was the first honest thing she'd offered in this entire conversation. We spent that night going through the box together, Owen and I, reading years of my mother's careful, hopeful handwriting spread across our kitchen table like fragments of a decade we'd both been robbed of. Most of it was ordinary. Updates about her garden, questions about our lives, small worries about growing older alone. But one letter, dated almost 6 years back, stopped us both cold. I hope you don't mind me asking, but something in the last statement Judith sent about the family trust caught my eye. A few of the transfer categories look unusual to someone who spent 30 years doing this professionally. I'm sure it's nothing, but I'd be happy to take a closer look if it would help. I still remember how to read a ledger, even in retirement. Owen went very still beside me. The family trust, he said slowly. My dad's trust. Mom's managed it alone since he passed, because none of us ever really understood the finances. We sat with that for a long, quiet moment, a new and colder shape emerging underneath everything Judith had already confessed to. You don't think? I think, I said carefully, we need someone who actually understands trust accounting to look at exactly what your mother's been managing for the last decade, because I don't believe for 1 second that a woman capable of hiding 12 years of letters this precisely was only ever worried about hurt feelings. Owen nodded slowly, something hardening in his expression that I recognized from the garage, from the kitchen doorway, the specific, quiet resolve of someone finally done accepting a story simply because it was the one he'd always been told. Naomi Cortez, the forensic accountant Owen's attorney recommended, took 11 days to go through a decade of trust statements Judith had always insisted were too complicated to bother the family with. What she found justified every ounce of my mother's quiet, professional suspicion. Nearly $90,000 moved out of the family trust over the years in small, carefully staggered transfers, each one disguised under vague administrative categories designed to blend into routine account maintenance rather than draw attention from anyone who wasn't specifically trained to look for it. This isn't sloppy mismanagement, Naomi told us, spreading the documentation across the table. This is someone who understood exactly how to make theft look boring enough that no one would ever double-check it. Attorney Simone Delacroix filed a formal claim on Owen's behalf within the week, backed by Naomi's full forensic report. Faced with undeniable documentation, Judith agreed to a structured restitution settlement rather than risk a criminal referral. Full repayment over 5 years, combined with permanent removal from any financial authority over the trust, now managed instead by an independent, licensed trustee. Owen set boundaries with his mother that week that he'd never once considered necessary in 14 years of marriage. Supervised, limited contact, no unsupervised access to our home, no more casual weekly dinners that had, we now understood, doubled as convenient opportunities to keep controlling our lives in ways neither of us had ever fully clocked. My mother, when I finally told her everything, absorbed it with the same steady, unshakable calm she'd apparently carried through 12 years of unanswered letters. I always wondered, she said quietly, why the numbers on that one statement never quite sat right with me. I spent the last 4 months of my mother's life reading her every single letter Judith had hidden, one at a time, in the exact order she'd written them, a decade of ordinary devotion finally reaching the person it was always meant for, 12 years too late to matter for most of it, but somehow, impossibly, exactly on time for what remained. She passed peacefully on a quiet Tuesday morning, my hand in hers, 12 years of manufactured silence replaced, in the end, by 4 months of everything we should have had all along. Judith and I don't speak anymore. Owen maintains careful, limited contact with her, mostly logistics, mostly distant. I don't know if that will ever change, and I've stopped needing it to. What I understand now, that I wish I'd understood 12 years ago, is that isolation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic betrayal you can point to and refuse. It arrives quietly, one small manufactured story at a time, told separately to exactly the right people, until an entire relationship simply stops existing without either side ever consciously choosing to end it. My mother wrote to me every single month for over a decade, never once receiving a reply, never once fully giving up. I spent that same decade grieving a mother I believed had already let me go. We were both wrong about each other for 12 years, because neither of us ever thought to question the story we'd been handed instead of the one we were actually living. If you found out that the silence you'd grieved for over a decade was never real, that someone had been manufacturing it the entire time, would you have kept believing the story you were told, or started asking the questions I wish I'd asked years sooner? If Grace's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real emotional journeys like hers.